The funeral flowers were still fresh when Maya found herself crumpled against the old wooden fence behind St. Catherine's Chapel, her black dress torn at the knee from stumbling through the cemetery gate. She had run from the reception, from the well-meaning touches and hollow condolences, from her mother's friends who whispered about poor Maya and such a tragedy at 20. The October wind cut through her like a blade, but she welcomed the physical pain. It was easier than the hollow ache in her chest where her heart used to be. 3 days ago, she had been planning a wedding. 3 days ago, James had been alive, laughing at something stupid she'd said while they painted their future bedroom. A soft yellow they'd both loved. Now the paint samples were still taped to the wall of an apartment. She couldn't bear to enter. Maya pressed her palms against the rough wood, letting the splinters bite her skin. She had held it together through the viewing, through the service, through watching his mother collapse over the casket. But now, alone with just the sound of distant traffic and the rustle of dying leaves, she finally let herself break. The sobs came in waves, each one more violent than the last. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't imagine a world where she would wake up tomorrow and he wouldn't be there. The engagement ring on her finger felt like a weight, a mockery of the promises they would never keep. She was so lost in her grief that she didn't notice the footsteps approaching on the gravel path, didn't hear the soft intake of breath, the hesitation, the quiet decision being made just a few feet away. It wasn't until a shadow fell across her that she looked up, tears streaming down her face, mascara painting dark rivers down her cheeks. Through her blurred vision, she saw a man standing there tall, with gentle eyes and graying hair, wearing a simple black suit that had seen better days. "I'm sorry," she choked out, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "I didn't mean to. This is probably private property." Instead of asking her to leave, instead of the awkward shuffle she expected, he did something that would change everything. He sat down beside her on the cold ground, his back against the fence, and without saying a word, he pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her. When she just stared at it, too shocked to move, he gently reached out and wiped the tears from her cheeks with a touch so careful, so kind, that it made her cry harder. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice carrying an accent she couldn't place. "Sometimes the world is too heavy to carry alone." Maya looked into his eyes, deep brown, lined with years of his own sorrows, saw something she hadn't expected to see again. Understanding, not pity, not discomfort, but genuine recognition of pain that ran bone deep. "I don't know you," she whispered. "No," he agreed, settling more comfortably against the fence. "But I know that look. I know what it means to feel like the sun will never rise again." For the first time in 3 days, Maya wasn't alone with her grief. And though she didn't know it yet, this stranger would become the person who would teach her how to live again. His name was Gabriel, and he had been visiting his wife's grave when he heard Maya's sobs carrying across the cemetery. He'd been walking this path for 7 years, every Sunday after morning service, always carrying the same yellow roses that had been Elena's favorite. "You don't have to tell me anything," Gabriel said, his voice steady and warm in the growing twilight. "But if you want to talk, I'm here. Sometimes it helps to tell a stranger the things you can't say to the people who know you." Maya found herself talking about James, about the drunk driver who had stolen her future in a split second on Highway 40, about the wedding dress hanging in her closet, the deposit they'd put down on a house with a garden where she'd planned to grow vegetables, about how everyone kept saying she was young, that she'd find love again, as if love was something you could simply replace, like a broken dish. Gabriel listened without interrupting, without offering platitudes or solutions. He simply sat with her in her pain, occasionally handing her the handkerchief when fresh tears came. When she finally ran out of words, he was quiet for a long moment. "Elena used to say that grief isn't something you get over," he said finally. "It's something you learn to carry differently. Like a stone in your pocket at first. It's so heavy you can barely walk. But eventually, you learn to shift the weight, to let it settle into a place where it doesn't break you with every step." "How long?" Maya asked, the question barely a whisper. "How long, what? How long before it stops feeling like I'm drowning?" Gabriel was quiet for so long that Maya wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with memory. "Elena died of cancer. We had 6 months to say goodbye, and somehow that felt both like forever, and not nearly long enough." He pulled a worn photograph from his wallet, a woman with dark hair and laughing eyes, her arms around a younger version of Gabriel. The drowning feeling. That lasted about a year. But the missing her, the wishing I could tell her about my day, show her a sunset, hear her laugh at my terrible jokes that never goes away. It just becomes part of you. Maya stared at the photograph, then at Gabriel's face. You still love her? I will always love her, he said simply. But I had to learn that loving someone who's gone doesn't mean you stop living. It means you live in a way that honors what they gave you. The church bells chimed 8 o'clock, and Maya realized she'd been sitting here for hours. The reception was probably over. Her family probably worried sick. But for the first time since the accident, she felt like she could breathe. I should go, she said, but made no move to stand. Will you be okay getting home? Maya looked at this stranger who had sat with her in the darkest moment of her life, who had offered comfort without expecting anything in return. I don't know, she admitted. I don't know how to go home to an empty apartment. I don't know how to sleep in a bed where we used to plan our mornings. Gabriel stood and offered her his hand. Then don't. Not tonight. My daughter runs a Badan bread, about 10 minutes from here. Good soup, clean sheets, and no one asking questions you're not ready to answer. Maya hesitated, then took his hand and let him help her to her feet. As they walked toward the cemetery gate, she realized she was taking her first steps into a world without James. But she wasn't taking them alone. The Morning Glory Inn was exactly what Maya needed, a Victorian house painted soft blue, with a wraparound porch and windows that glowed warmly in the darkness. Gabriel's daughter, Sarah, met them at the door with the same gentle eyes as her father and the practical kindness of someone who had seen heartbreak before. Room 3 is ready, Sarah said, leading them upstairs without asking questions. Fresh towels, extra blankets, and I'll bring some tea up in a minute. The room was simple but comfortable, a queen bed with a handmade quilt, a small writing desk by the window, and walls painted the color of early morning sky. Maya sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. Thank you, she said to Gabriel, who lingered in the doorway. I don't know why you helped me, but thank you. Alina used to volunteer at the grief counseling center, he said. She always said that sometimes the best medicine for a broken heart is just knowing you're not alone in the breaking. After he left, Maya sat in the window seat and looked out at the small garden behind the inn. Someone had planted it with care, roses, ornamental grasses that swayed in the night breeze, a small fountain that caught the moonlight. It was peaceful in a way that felt foreign to her now. Sarah knocked softly and brought in a tray with chamomile tea and homemade cookies. I lost my husband 4 years ago, she said quietly, settling into the chair by the desk. Heart attack at 38, left me with twin boys and a mortgage I couldn't afford. Maya looked up, surprised by the admission. I'm not telling you this to compare pain, Sarah continued. I'm telling you because I want you to know, that woman you were before, she's still in there, changed, maybe scarred. Definitely, but still there. I don't feel like her anymore, Maya admitted. I feel like I died with him. Part of you did, Sarah said matter-of-factly. The part that was half of a couple, that made plans assuming there would always be two. But the part that was just you, the part that existed before you met him, that part is stronger than you think. Maya sipped her tea, letting the warmth spread through her chest. How do you know? Because you're here. Because when my father found you tonight, you were crying, not giving up. There's a difference. That night, Maya slept better than she had in 3 days. She dreamed of James, but for the first time, they weren't nightmares. She dreamed of him laughing, of the way he used to make pancakes on Sunday mornings, of the time he'd surprised her with a picnic in the park where they'd first met. She woke to the sound of birds and the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from the kitchen. For just a moment, in that space between sleeping and waking, she forgot. She reached for James's side of the bed, expecting to find him there. The rush of memory hit her like a physical blow, but somehow, this morning, it didn't knock her down. She lay there, letting the grief wash over her, acknowledging it without being consumed by it. Gabriel was in the dining room when she came downstairs, reading a newspaper and eating what looked like the best breakfast she'd seen in weeks. He looked up when she entered, and his smile was warm and genuine. How did you sleep? Better than I expected, Maya said, accepting a plate from Sarah. Thank you, both of you. I don't know what I would have done last night. You would have figured it out, Gabriel said. People are stronger than they think, especially when they have no other choice. Maya ate in comfortable silence, watching through the window as the morning light turned the garden golden. She was surprised to find herself thinking about practical things she needed to call her boss, to deal with the wedding cancellations, to decide what to do with the apartment. The weight of James's absence was still there, would always be there. But sitting in this kitchen, surrounded by the quiet kindness of strangers who had become something more, she began to believe that maybe she could learn to carry it. Maya stayed at the Morning Glory Inn for 3 days. Not because she couldn't, go home, but because she needed time to remember who she was when she wasn't drowning in grief. Gabriel visited each morning, bringing coffee and conversation that never felt forced or artificial. On the third day, they walked together through the town's small business district. Maya found herself noticing things the way the autumn light filtered through the maple trees. The sound of children playing in the park, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery. Small things, but they felt significant, like her senses were slowly coming back to life. I used to paint, she said suddenly, stopping in front of an art supply store. Before James, before the wedding planning took over everything. I used to paint landscapes. Gabriel looked at the display of brushes and canvases in the window. What stopped you? Life, I guess. Work, relationship, adult responsibilities. She touched her reflection in the glass. I told myself I'd get back to it after the wedding, after we bought the house, after things settled down. Alina was a potter, Gabriel said. She had this studio in our basement, full of clay and glazes and half-finished pieces. After she died, I couldn't bear to go down there. I thought I was preserving her memory by keeping everything exactly as she left it. What changed? Sarah. She came over one day about 2 years ago and found me just sitting in the studio, holding one of Elena's unfinished bowls. She said, "Dad, Mom didn't create because she wanted to leave monuments. She created because it made her feel alive." Maya turned to look at him. "What did you do?" "I finished the bowl. Badly," he laughed. "But I finished it. And then I started taking pottery classes. Not to replace Alina or to become her, but to understand what she felt when she was creating. To connect with that part of her that was pure joy." They stood in silence for a moment, watching people pass on the sidewalk. Maya realized she was thinking about James differently, now not just about his absence, but about the things he'd loved, the way he'd encouraged her dreams, even when she'd let them slide. "He always said I should enter my work in the local art fair," she said quietly. "He used to joke that he was dating the next Georgia O'Keeffe." "Maybe he still is," Gabriel said gently. "Maybe love doesn't end just because someone dies. Maybe it transforms into something else, a voice that encourages us to become who we were meant to be." That afternoon, Maya called her boss and arranged to take a leave of absence. She called her mother and had a long, difficult conversation about grief and healing and the difference between moving on and moving forward. She called the wedding vendors and began the painful process of canceling arrangements. But she also walked into the art supply store and bought a small canvas, a basic set of paints, and 2 brushes. Standing at the counter, her hands shaking slightly as she pulled out her credit card, she felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks: anticipation. That evening, she sat in the inn's garden with her new supplies spread on a small table. The light was golden and soft, perfect for painting. She squeezed a small amount of yellow ochre onto her palette and mixed it with white, creating the exact shade of the late afternoon sky. Gabriel found her there an hour later, completely absorbed in capturing the way the light fell across the fountain. He didn't interrupt, just sat quietly on a nearby bench, watching her work. When she finally looked up, she had tears on her cheeks, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of recognition, the joy of remembering who she was. Beyond her loss, the bittersweet pleasure of doing something James would have loved to see. "He would have been proud," Gabriel said softly. Maya looked at her painting, rough, imperfect, but alive with color and light. "I think he would have been. And I think that's enough reason to keep going." For the first time since the accident, Maya felt like she had a purpose beyond just surviving. She had a way to honor James's memory and reclaim herself at the same time. It was a small beginning, but it was a beginning nonetheless. 2 weeks later, Maya was back in her apartment, but it felt different now. She had rearranged the furniture, taken down some of the photos that had been too painful to look at, and set up a small easel by the living room window. The wedding dress still hung in the closet, but she'd stopped avoiding that room. Gabriel had become a regular part of her life, stopping by twice a week with coffee and conversation. Their friendship had developed naturally, built on shared understanding and mutual respect. He never pushed her to feel better or move faster than she was ready to, and she never felt like she had to perform healing for his benefit. "I've been thinking about what you said," Maya told him one afternoon as they sat in her kitchen, watching her paint dry on the windowsill. "About love transforming instead of ending." Gabriel nodded, stirring honey into his tea. "What about it?" "I think James is still with me, but not in the way I expected. Not as a presence I can touch or talk to, but as a voice that reminds me of who I am when I'm brave enough to listen." She had been painting every day, working through her grief with color and light. The canvases that lined her walls were raw, and emotional storm clouds and breaking waves, bare trees against winter skies, but also surprising moments of beauty. A sunrise over the cemetery where she'd first met Gabriel. The garden at the inn where she'd learned to sleep again. "I want to show you something," she said, leading him to the bedroom she'd been avoiding. She opened the closet and pulled out a canvas she'd been working on, a portrait of James, but not from a photograph. This was James, as she carried him, in her memory, laughing, his eyes crinkled with joy, his hands gesturing as he told one of his terrible jokes. "It's beautiful," Gabriel said, and she could hear the understanding in his voice. "I painted it from love, not from loss," Maya explained. "I finally understand the difference." That weekend, Sarah called with news. The local community center was hosting an art show for emerging artists, and she thought Maya should consider submitting some work. The idea terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "I don't know if I'm ready," Maya told Gabriel when she called him about it. "Alina used to say that ready is just another word for afraid," he replied. "The question isn't whether you're ready. The question is whether you're willing to try." Maya spent the next week selecting her best pieces, 5 paintings that told the story of her journey from devastation to the first tentative steps toward healing. She included the portrait of James, not as a memorial to what she'd lost, but as a celebration of what she'd gained from loving him. The night before the submission deadline, she stood in her apartment surrounded by her work. 6 months ago, she couldn't have imagined being here, couldn't have believed that something beautiful could grow from such complete destruction. Gabriel arrived with takeout from their favorite Chinese restaurant, and they ate surrounded by her paintings, planning how to transport them to the community center. "I'm scared," Maya admitted, as they packed the canvases carefully in bubble wrap. "Good," Gabriel said. "Being scared means you're doing something that matters. What if people don't understand them? What if they think I'm exploiting my grief?" Gabriel was quiet for a moment, then walked over to the portrait of James. "When I look at this, I don't see exploitation. I see love. I see someone who loved deeply enough to let that love transform her instead of destroy her." Maya looked at her paintings with new eyes. They were her story, her journey from a woman who had lost everything to a woman who was learning to live again. They were honest and raw and beautiful, and they were hers. The next morning, she walked into the community center and submitted her work. Her hands shook as she filled out the application, but she didn't hesitate. For the first time in months, she was moving towards something instead of away from it. Standing in the parking lot afterward, she called James's mother, whom she'd been avoiding out of guilt and shared pain. "I entered an art show," she said when the older woman answered. "I painted again. James always said I should, and I finally did it." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Maya wondered if the call had dropped. Then she heard soft crying. "He would be so proud," James's mother whispered. "And I'm proud of you too, for finding a way to keep going, to keep growing. That's what love does, helps us become who we're meant to be." Maya hung up the phone and stood in the autumn sunshine, feeling something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope, not the desperate hope for things to go back to how they were, but the steady hope of someone who was learning to build a new life from the pieces of the old one. The art show was scheduled for the first weekend in November, and Maya found herself checking her phone obsessively for news about the selections. Gabriel had started teaching her to work with clay at the community center's pottery studio, and she discovered that there was something deeply satisfying about creating something with her hands, about the way the clay yielded to pressure and intention. "You're a natural," Gabriel said one evening as they worked side by side. Maya was attempting her first bowl, and while it was lopsided and imperfect, it was undeniably hers. "Alina would have loved this," he continued, his own hands shaping clay with practiced ease. "She always said pottery was meditation in motion." Maya looked at Gabriel's profile as he worked, noting the way his face softened when he talked about his wife. Over the weeks, she had learned more about their life together, how they'd met in college, how they'd traveled through Europe in their 20s, how they'd faced Elena's illness together, with a grace that still took Maya's breath away. "Can I ask you something?" Maya said, her hands stilling on the clay. "Of course. Do you ever feel guilty about building a life after she's gone?" Gabriel's hands stopped moving. He was quiet for so long that Maya wondered if she'd overstepped, but then he spoke, his voice thoughtful. "Every day for the first 3 years, I felt guilty for laughing, for enjoying a sunset, for having moments where I forgot to be sad. I felt like I was betraying her memory by not carrying my grief like a banner. What changed? Sarah, mostly. She sat me down one day and said, "Dad, Mom didn't love you so you could stop living when she died. She loved you so you could live fully, even without her." He resumed working the clay, his movements sure and gentle. I realized that the best way to honor what we had was to keep becoming the person she'd fallen in love with. Maya felt something shift in her chest, loosening of a knot she hadn't even realized was there. "I think I've been afraid that healing means forgetting." "Healing doesn't mean forgetting," Gabriel said. "It means learning to remember with love instead of with pain." That night, Maya got the call. Her work had been selected for the art show. She would have a small section of wall space to display 3 of her paintings, including the portrait of James. The opening reception was in 2 weeks. She called Gabriel immediately, her voice shaking with excitement and terror. "I'm going to need moral support," she said. "I don't think I can do this alone." "You won't be alone," he assured her. "Sarah and I will be there. And Maya, you're braver than you know." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Maya had her paintings professionally framed, wrote artist statements that were honest without being overwhelming, and bought a dress for the opening not black, but a deep forest green that made her feel like herself again. The night before the show, she stood in her apartment, looking at the spaces on her walls, where her paintings had hung. The apartment felt different, now empty, but expectant. She had been thinking about moving, about finding a place that could hold both her memories and her future. Gabriel arrived with dinner, and found her sitting on the floor, surrounded by photo albums. "Second thoughts?" he asked, sitting down beside her. "Not second thoughts," she said, closing the album of wedding photos. "Just remembering. Tomorrow feels like a beginning, and I wanted to spend some time with the ending before I step into it." Gabriel understood. They ate quietly, and then he helped her pack the albums away, not hiding them, but putting them in their proper place, part of her history, but not the whole story. "Ready for tomorrow?" he asked as he prepared to leave. Maya looked around her apartment, at the empty walls that would soon be filled with new work, at the easel by the window, where she'd rediscovered herself. "I think so," she said. "For the first time in months, I actually think so." That night, she dreamed of James again, but this time he was standing in an art gallery, looking at her paintings with pride and love. In the dream, he turned to her and said, "You found your way back to yourself. That's all I ever wanted for you." Maya woke up with tears on her cheeks, but they were tears of gratitude. She was ready to share her story, to let others see the path she'd walked from devastation to hope. She was ready to show them that love could survive even death, transformed into something that helped rather than hindered growth. The opening reception was everything Maya had hoped for, and everything she'd feared. The community center's gallery space was packed with people, and she found herself standing next to her paintings, fielding questions from strangers about her technique, her inspiration, her journey as an artist. Gabriel and Sarah stayed close, providing support when conversations became too intense, or when Maya needed a moment to step away. She watched Gabriel as he moved through the crowd, noting how naturally he interacted with people, how his presence seemed to calm and center those around him. "Your friend is quite something," said a woman who introduced herself as Margaret, one of the show's organizers. "He's been telling everyone about your work, but not in an overwhelming way. He has a gift for helping people see what they might miss." Maya looked across the room to where Gabriel was talking to a young couple about the painting of the cemetery fence, the place where they'd first met. He was gesturing gently, his voice too low for Maya to hear, but she could see the impact of his words on the couple's faces. "He saved my life," Maya said quietly. Margaret smiled. "I can see that, but I think maybe you've saved his too." The comment stayed with Maya as the evening progressed. She sold 2 paintings, not the portrait of James, which she'd marked as not for sale, but 2 of her landscapes. The buyers were a retired teacher and a young mother, both of whom spoke about how her work had moved them. "There's something hopeful in the sadness," the teacher said. "It's honest about pain, but it doesn't wallow in it." As the crowd began to thin, Maya found herself standing alone with Gabriel in front of her paintings. The gallery lights were softer now, and her work looked different, in the changing light deeper, more nuanced. "I'm proud of you," Gabriel said simply. "I couldn't have done this without you," Maya replied. "You know that, right?" Gabriel was quiet for a moment, then turned to face her fully. "Maya, I need to tell you something. About that night we met." Something in his tone made her heart skip. "What about it?" "I wasn't just visiting Elena's grave. I was saying goodbye." Really goodbye. I had been thinking about joining her. Maya felt the air leave her lungs. Gabriel, ... I had stopped believing that life could be good again. I had Sarah, and I love her, but I felt like I was just going through the motions. That night, I had made a decision. Maya reached for his hand without thinking. What changed you? He said simply. Finding you there, seeing your pain and recognizing it as my own, but also seeing your strength. It reminded me that grief, shared is grief halved, that sometimes the way through the darkness is to help someone else find their light. Maya felt tears starting, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of understanding, of recognition, of the deep connection that forms between people who have saved each other without even knowing it. We found each other at exactly the right moment, she said. Yes, Gabriel agreed. And I think maybe we're supposed to keep finding each other. The meaning behind his words was clear, and Maya felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in months, not the desperate, consuming love she'd had with James, but something steadier, deeper. A love built on shared understanding and mutual healing. I'm not ready, she said honestly. I don't know if I'll ever be ready for what I think you're suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything, Gabriel said gently. I'm just saying that sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the spaces between what we planned and what we never could have imagined. Maya looked at her paintings, at the visual story of her journey from devastation to hope. 6 months ago, she would never have believed that she could be standing here, in a gallery, celebrating her own work, feeling something that might eventually become love for someone new. Can we take it slow? She asked. Can we just see what grows? Gabriel smiled, and it was the smile of someone who understood that the best things in life couldn't be rushed or forced, only nurtured with patience and care. We can take it as slow as you need, he said. I'm not going anywhere. As they walked out of the gallery together, Maya felt something she hadn't experienced since before the accident, the feeling of moving towards something rather than away from it. She didn't know what her future would look like, but for the first time in months, she was excited to find out. Winter settled over the town like a gentle blanket, and Maya found herself creating a new rhythm. She had moved to a smaller apartment closer to the community center, where she could walk to her art classes and pottery sessions. The space was brighter, with better light for painting, and it felt like hers in a way the old apartment never had again. Gabriel had become a constant presence in her life, but their relationship remained carefully undefined. They had dinner together twice a week, worked clay side by side in the pottery studio, and took long walks through the town's parks and neighborhoods. He was teaching her to see the world through an artist's eyes, to notice the way lights changed throughout the day, how shadows created depth and meaning. You're becoming yourself again, Sarah observed one afternoon, as they had coffee at the inn. But not the same self. A deeper version. Maya considered this as she watched Gabriel through the window, where he was helping Sarah's twin boys build a snowman. He moved with the easy grace of someone who had found his place in the world, who had learned to balance remembering the past with embracing the present. I think I'm becoming who I was always meant to be, Maya said. James saw it in me, but I was too busy planning our future to really develop it. Now I don't have the luxury of waiting for the perfect moment. And Gabriel, Maya felt her cheeks warm. Gabriel is ... complicated. We're both carrying love for other people, but we're also creating something new together. I don't know what to call it. Maybe you don't have to call it anything yet, Sarah suggested. Maybe it's enough to just let it be what it is. That evening, Maya and Gabriel attended the opening of another local art show. Maya had 3 pieces in this one, including a new painting she'd titled Learning to Breathe Again, a landscape of the cemetery where they'd met, but painted in spring colors. With new growth pushing through the winter earth, standing in front of the painting, a young woman approached Maya with tears in her eyes. I lost my husband last year, she said quietly. Car accident. I saw your artist statement, and I wanted to thank you for showing that it's possible to find hope again without betraying the love we've lost. Maya found herself pulled into a conversation that lasted over an hour. The woman, Janet, was struggling with the same guilt Maya had felt about moving forward, about the moments when grief wasn't the dominant emotion in her life. I keep thinking that if I start to feel happy again, it means I didn't love him enough, Janet said. I thought the same thing, Maya replied. But I've learned that love doesn't end when someone dies. It transforms. The love I had for my fiancé is now part of how I love myself, how I love my art, how I love the people who've helped me heal. Gabriel watched from across the room as Maya talked with Janet, seeing the way Maya's face had lit up with purpose. This was who she was becoming, not just an artist, but a healer. Someone who could transform her own pain into a gift for others. Later, as they walked home through the snow-covered streets, Gabriel took Maya's hand. It was the first time they'd touched with intention. And Maya felt a flutter of something that was part nervousness, part excitement. "That was beautiful," he said. "What you did tonight, the way you helped that woman. Alina would have done the same thing." "Is that why you're drawn to me?" Maya asked. "Because I remind you of her?" Gabriel stopped walking and turned to face her. "You don't remind me of Alina. You remind me of myself, the person I was when I was with her. The person who believed that love could transform pain into purpose." Maya felt her heart skip. "And now I'm remembering that person didn't have to die with her. That maybe there's room in my life for both the love I carry for Alina and the love I'm beginning to feel for you." The word hung between them in the cold air, visible in the cloud of Gabriel's breath. Love. Not the desperate, consuming love of youth, but the steady, intentional love of people who had learned what it meant to lose everything and choose to keep going. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I need you to know that James will always be part of me, that the love I had for him didn't end. It just, evolved." "I know," Gabriel said, pulling her closer. "I wouldn't want it any other way. The fact that you can love him and still open your heart to me, that's not a flaw, Maya, a gift." As they stood there in the falling snow, Maya realized that she was about to step into something she'd never thought possibly, a love that didn't require her to forget the past, but instead helped her integrate it into a future she was finally ready to build. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a sense of possibility that Maya hadn't felt in over a year. She had been working on a series of paintings about transformation, images of butterflies emerging from cocoons, trees budding after winter, flowers pushing through sidewalk cracks. The work was selling well, and she'd been approached by a gallery in the city about a potential solo show. Gabriel had been spending more time at her apartment, and they had developed an easy domesticity that felt both new and familiar. He made coffee in the mornings while she painted. She cooked dinner while he worked on his pottery, and they spent evenings reading together on the couch, comfortable in shared silence. "I've been thinking," Maya said one evening as they walked through the park where she'd been painting spring landscapes, "about the future, about what I wanted to look like." Gabriel squeezed her hand. "Tell me." "I want to start a grief counseling program," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "Using art as therapy. I keep thinking about that woman at the gallery, about how many people are out there drowning in their grief, with no one to throw them a lifeline." Gabriel stopped walking and turned to face her, his eyes bright with understanding. "That's a beautiful idea. I don't have the credentials to be a therapist," Maya continued, "but I could partner with someone who does. Create a space where people can paint their way through their pain, where they can see that it's possible to create something beautiful from something broken." "Alina would have loved this," Gabriel said softly. "She always believed that creativity was the soul's way of healing itself." Maya felt a familiar pang at the mention of Alina, but it was different now, not jealousy or insecurity, but a deep appreciation for the woman who had shaped the man she was falling in love with. She had seen Elena's pottery in Gabriel's house, had learned about her kindness and wisdom through Gabriel's stories. Alina wasn't a threat to their relationship. She was part of its foundation. "I want to call it the Fence Project," Maya said. "After the place where we met, where you taught me that I didn't have to carry my grief alone." Gabriel's eyes filled with tears. "Maya, that's perfect." They spent the next few weeks researching and planning. Maya reached out to local therapists and grief counselors, while Gabriel used his connections in the community to find potential funding sources. Sarah offered space at the inn for initial workshops, and the community center agreed to host larger programs. The first workshop was scheduled for a Saturday morning in May. Maya had prepared carefully, gathering supplies and creating a gentle curriculum that would guide participants through expressing their grief visually, without forcing anyone to share more than they were comfortable with. 5 people showed up, 3 women and 2 men, all carrying the particular weight of fresh loss. Maya recognized the look in their eyes, the way they held themselves carefully, as if sudden movements might shatter what little control they had left. "I'm not an art teacher," Maya began, her hands shaking slightly as she addressed the group. "I'm someone who learned to paint her way through the worst thing that ever happened to her. I'm here because I believe that sometimes the things we can't say with words can be expressed with color and line and texture." She told them about James, about the night she'd met Gabriel, about the long journey from that broken woman crying by the fence to the person she was becoming. She was honest about the ongoing nature of grief, about the fact that healing wasn't linear, that some days were still harder than others. The goal isn't to get over your loss, she said. The goal is to learn to carry it in a way that doesn't break you. Art can't fix what's broken, but it can help us find meaning in the brokenness. Gabriel watched from the back of the room as Maya guided the participants through their first exercise, painting their grief as a color and texture. Without trying to make it represent anything specific, he saw the way people's shoulders relaxed as they lost themselves in the process, the way tears flowed freely as they worked. By the end of the session, the room was filled with powerful, raw images, dark swirls of purple and black, jagged lines of red and orange, but also unexpected touches of gold and silver, hints of light breaking through the darkness. "This is what grief looks like," said one participant, a man who had lost his teenage son. "Ugly and beautiful at the same time." "Yes," Maya agreed. "And that's okay. It's all okay." As people filed out, several signed up for the next workshop. Maya felt a deep satisfaction she hadn't experienced even with her gallery success. This was what she was meant to do, not just create art, but help others discover their own capacity for transforming pain into something meaningful. Gabriel helped her clean up the supplies, and they worked in comfortable silence, both processing what they'd just witnessed. "You are amazing," he said finally. "Watching you today, seeing how you helped those people, it reminded me why I fell in love with you." Maya looked up from the paintbrushes she was washing. "You fell in love with me?" Gabriel set down the stack of canvases he was organizing and walked over to her. "I've been in love with you for months, Maya. I was just waiting for the right moment to say it." Maya felt her heart skip, but not with fear this time. With joy. "I love you too," she said. "I love the man you are, the man you've become because of what you've been through. I love how you helped me find my way back to myself." Gabriel cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away tears. She hadn't realized she was crying. "I love you for who you are, not who you remind me of. I love your strength, your creativity, your enormous heart. I love that you can hold space for both grief and joy, that you've learned to let them coexist." When he kissed her, it was with the tenderness of someone who understood that love could be both fragile and enduring, that it could honor the past while embracing the future. As they stood there in the empty community center, surrounded by the evidence of shared healing, Maya realized that she had found something she'd never thought possibly, a love that didn't require her to be anyone other than exactly who she was, scars and all. 1 year later, Maya stood in the same spot where Gabriel had first found her, crying by the fence. But this time, she wasn't alone, and she wasn't crying. She was placing a bouquet of yellow rosy Salona's favorite next to a small plaque that read, "In memory of those we've lost, in honor of those still learning to live." Gabriel stood beside her, his hand warm in hers, as they observed the memorial garden that had grown around the fence. The fence project had expanded beyond anything Maya had imagined, becoming a recognized grief counseling program that combined art therapy with traditional support groups. The garden was part of that expansion, a place where people could come to remember, to grieve, to find peace. "She would have loved this," Gabriel said, looking at the plaque that honored Alina alongside James and dozens of others whose deaths had left ripples of grief in the community. "They both would have," Maya agreed, placing a second bouquet and flowers, James's favorite, next to the roses. The memorial garden was just one part of the celebration happening today. Maya's first solo art show was opening at the City Gallery that evening, featuring 30 paintings that told the story of her journey from devastation to hope. The show was titled The Fence Project, Portraits of Healing, and it included not just her own work, but pieces created by participants in her grief counseling program. Sarah approached from the path, carrying Maya's goddaughter, her and Gabriel's 6-month-old daughter Hope. The baby had been a surprise, a gift that Maya had never expected to receive. At 44, Gabriel had thought his family was complete, and Maya had assumed motherhood was a dream she'd lost with James. But love, they'd learned, had its own timeline. "She's been fussing for you," Sarah said, handing the baby to Maya. "I think she knows today is special." Maya took Hope into her arms, marveling as she always did at the perfect weight of her. The way her small fingers curled around Maya's thumb. Hope had been conceived in love and born into a family that understood the preciousness of life, that knew how quickly everything could change. "Hello, little one," Maya murmured, walking slowly around the garden, while Hope settled against her shoulder. "Today is the day Mama shows the world what she's learned about love and loss and finding your way back to the light." Gabriel watched his wife and daughter, still amazed by the turn his life had taken. He had never expected to remarry, had never imagined that his heart had room for another great love. But Maya hadn't replaced Alanish, had simply created a new space in his life, one that honored his past while building toward their future. The wedding had been small, held in the same garden where they now stood. Maya had worn a simple dress the color of morning sky, and Gabriel had read vows that spoke of second chances and the courage to love again. James's mother had been there, along with Elena's sister. Both women understanding that love doesn't end with death, expands, creating room for new love to grow alongside old. "Are you ready for tonight?" Gabriel asked, joining Maya and Hope by the fountain. Maya looked at the art supplies set up at several stations around the garden, where people were already beginning to gather for the day's workshop. She saw familiar faces: Janet, who had become a close friend and was now training to become a grief counselor herself; Robert, who had lost his son and was now volunteering with the program; Maria, whose paintings of her deceased husband had become some of the most powerful pieces in the show. "I'm ready," Maya said, and she meant it. "I'm finally ready to show the world what's possible when we choose to transform our pain instead of letting it destroy us." The afternoon workshop was the largest they'd ever held, with over 50 participants creating art that expressed their journeys through grief. Maya moved among them, offering encouragement and guidance. While Gabriel worked with the children's program, he'd started helping kids express their feelings about loss through clay and finger painting. As the day wound down and people began to leave for the evening's gallery opening, Maya found herself once again standing by the fence. But this time, she wasn't alone. Janet was there, along with several other program participants, all of them looking at the spot where Maya's healing had begun. "You know what I think?" Janet said, her voice thoughtful. "I think the fence was never about keeping people out. I think it was about giving people something to lean on when they couldn't stand on their own." Maya felt tears prick her eyes. "I think you're right." That evening, the gallery was packed with people who had come to witness the visual story of transformation. Maya's paintings lined the walls, each one a chapter in the book of her healing. The portrait of James hung in the center, surrounded by the images that had grown from her grief-storm clouds, giving way to sunrise. Bare trees budding with new life. Broken things becoming beautiful. But it was the final painting that stopped people in their tracks. It was a portrait of the fence, but not as Maya had first seen it, not as a barrier or a place of despair. This fence was surrounded by flowers, with people sitting along its length, supporting each other, sharing their stories. In the background, barely visible but unmistakably present, were the figures of those who had been lost, not as ghosts but as light, as love that continued to nurture and guide. "It's called The Fence Project," Maya explained to the crowd that had gathered around the painting. "It's about the fact that we don't have to carry our grief alone. That sometimes the most profound healing happens when we're brave enough to sit with someone else's pain and let them sit with ours." Gabriel stood at the back of the crowd, holding hope, watching his wife share her truth with the world. He thought about the night he'd found her crying by that fence, how close they'd both come to giving up. He thought about Alina, who had taught him that love was meant to multiply, not diminish, and about James, whose death had ultimately led to so much life. As the evening wound down, and people began to leave, Maya found herself surrounded by the community she'd built, people who had learned alongside her that healing was possible, that love could survive even the most devastating loss, that beauty could grow from the most broken places. "Thank you," she said to the group, her voice thick with emotion, "for teaching me that I'm not alone in this, for showing me that healing isn't something we do by ourselves, but something we do together." As they walked home through the quiet streets, Gabriel carrying the sleeping baby, while Maya leaned against his shoulder, Maya felt a deep sense of completion, not because the story was over, but because she had finally learned how to write it with hope instead of despair, with love instead of fear, with the knowledge that even the darkest nights eventually give way to morning. "I love you," she whispered to Gabriel as they reached their front door. "I love you too," he replied, kissing the top of her head. "And I love the life we've built together. The broken, beautiful, impossible life that neither of us could have imagined." Maya looked up at the stars, thinking of James and Alina, of all the people who had been lost, and all the people who were still learning to live. She thought of the fence where her healing had begun, now surrounded by flowers, and filled with the laughter of people who had found their way back to hope. Sometimes, she realized, the most powerful endings are really beginnings in disguise. Sometimes the fence that seems like a barrier is actually a bridge, carrying us from who we were to who we're meant to become. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we discover that love doesn't end with death, it transforms. creating new possibilities we never could have imagined, teaching us that the human heart is capable of holding both grief and joy, loss and hope, endings and beginnings, all at the same time. As Maya closed the door behind them and stepped into the warm light of home, she carried with her the knowledge that she had been broken and rebuilt, that she had learned to love again without forgetting how to remember, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones that teach us how to live with our scars while still believing in the possibility of healing. The fence had become a bridge, and she had learned to cross it,